Welcome to the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation's virtual Great Ladies event, celebrating 10 years of science and fashion.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andrea Mitchell. And in these challenging times, the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation and I are pleased to welcome you to this virtual edition of our annual Great Ladies Luncheon. We are so grateful to come together this way to recognize the critical support of our ADDF friends and family in our mission to rapidly accelerate the development of drugs to prevent, treat, and ultimately cure Alzheimer's disease. In addition, this year marks a wonderful milestone. This is the 10th anniversary of this event. Back in 2011, Elise Lefkowitz founded the Great Ladies Luncheon in honor of her mother, Estelle, who suffered from Alzheimer's for 15 years. I myself have been honored to participate these past 10 years, and throughout the event, thanks to Elise and thanks to you, we have raised nearly $4 million to fund the ADDF's innovative research. We have a lot to share with you today, an informative discussion, inspiration, and perhaps even a surprise or two. In just a few moments, we will bring you our signature symposium featuring ADDF Founding Executive Director and Chief Science Officer, Dr. Howard Fillit, and one of the ADDF's outstanding researchers, Dr. Roberta Brinton, who together will explore some of the exciting advances in Alzheimer's research. But first, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Fillit to share his thoughts on caring for Alzheimer's patients during this unprecedented health crisis, and the way forward, of course, for the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation during these unprecedented times. Hi, Dr. Fillit. It's great to be here with you today. Thank you so much for doing this again. Most of us know someone who is caring for an Alzheimer's patient, a caregiver, a loved one, family member. How has the coronavirus increased the stress for family members and caregivers of Alzheimer's patients?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea, and thanks for being here with us, too. Coronavirus has, I think, really made a big impact on Alzheimer's care. And I think the biggest impact really is, as you mentioned, on stress. And my number one prescription for caregivers of Alzheimer's patients is really to try to find ways to relieve stress, whether it's getting respite for an hour, if you can leave your loved one alone for an hour, or taking a walk with your loved one that has Alzheimer's disease, trying to meditate or use yoga or exercise, anything that you can do to relieve stress. Another important component of relieving stress for Alzheimer's caregivers is staying connected, because as we like to say, if the caregiver fails, then the patient will fail, and that's the most terrible thing.
Dr. Fillit, one of the most stressful situations is for families who have loved ones in nursing homes or in assisted living, where they are restricted and where families cannot visit any longer and can't communicate with people with Alzheimer's. What advice do you have for those families?
Well, I think it's a terrible situation, actually. 80-90% of people in nursing homes today have some form of dementia, mostly Alzheimer's disease. And of course, as we all know, these patients are isolated now, and family members are not allowed to visit. And I can't imagine what it's like for staff in that home to take care of these patients. The care needs are very intimate and severe. Most patients need assistance with things like feeding and that kind of thing. I think it's very hard. I mean, one could try an iPad. I suppose they would still recognize a face or a voice, and perhaps that can be helpful if the nursing home can accommodate the use of an iPad for a loved one. The staffing needs are very difficult in nursing home settings, and but I would hope that at least in some nursing homes we could get to using these kind of devices to cheer people up with dementia. They could respond to that.
How much has this pandemic and the forced isolation set back the ADDF?
Well, ADDF, the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, is very fortunate because the overhead, all of the overhead for the ADDF is paid for by a private family foundation from the Estee Lauder family, Leonard Lauder and Ronald Lauder. We're going full steam ahead. We're all working from home. And we had a staff meeting on Friday, and we all agreed that we're working as hard as ever and probably more efficiently than being in the office. I think the coronavirus pandemic has affected clinical trials in an important way in terms of dropouts and missed visits, and it'll affect studies around the world. And in science in general, these experiments take a long time, like the chemistry and so on. They take months and months and months. And, any step along the way where the science gets affected degrades the science. And so to the degree that scientists can't get into their university laboratories, it also affects the preclinical research.
Finally, after 22 years of having been involved as the founding executive director and all the research and the clinical trials, what are you most optimistic about?
Well, Andrew, I use the word amazing. It just amazes me where we are today compared to where we were 20 years ago, or when I started 40 years ago. I'm most optimistic about two things. One is we're going to have a blood test for Alzheimer's in about 2 or 3 or 4 years. And that's going to really change the world. It's going to bring Alzheimer's disease into the mainstream of medicine, and it's going to make clinical trials much more efficient and rigorous. And I think it's really exciting that that we're doing through the Diagnostics Accelerator in partnership with leading philanthropists like Bill Gates and Leonard Lauder and David Dolby and Jeff and Mackenzie Bezos and others, that we're going to be able to do that. And the last thing is that there's over 100 clinical trials going on now. ADDF is participating in over 20%. We've actually funded the development of 20% of the drugs that are currently in clinical trials right now. And that, in a humble sort of way, is just incredible. And the other thing is that the majority of the drugs that are in clinical trials now are what we call non-amyloid drugs. So there had been a huge emphasis on this one target, and now we have a whole diversity of targets by many different companies that are looking at all different pathways. Ultimately, between the biomarkers and the multiple pathways, we're going to get to precision medicine for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease using combination therapy, just like has happened in the last 10 years or so for cancer. Just one more thing, if I may, is about prevention. I mean, we have prevention trials that have shown that Alzheimer's disease can be slowed, it can be prevented, cognitive decline with aging, with with proper lifestyle and public health and management of comorbidities. We have data now from randomized clinical trials that show that Alzheimer's disease can be prevented.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fillit. And now we turn to the symposium portion of today's event, in which Drs. Fillit and Brinton are going to discuss where we stand in the fight to bring promising therapies to patients and to their caregivers and families.
Hi, Andrea. I want to thank you so much for your longstanding support of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation. It's been many years, and we really appreciate it. Of course, I'd also like to thank Lise and Mark Lefkowitz for their ongoing support of ADDF over these many years and this event, creating this fantastic Great Ladies Luncheon event. Of course, I'm Howard Fillit, and it's great to be here with you to mark our 10th annual Ladies Luncheon with this special presentation we have for you today, including a conversation with one of our leading scientists and one of my great colleagues for many years, Dr. Roberta Diaz Brinton. Before I turn it over to Dr. Brinton, I just wanted to say a little bit about our research. We have a venture philanthropy model at ADDF. It's kind of unique, although some foundations are taking it on now. And as you know, this has enabled us to make enormous progress because our foundation is so focused on one thing, and that's the development of new drugs for Alzheimer's disease. And particularly today, we're very focused on clinical trials, testing these drugs in human beings. So we've been able to fund a number of biotech companies through our model and had some real success moving the needle forward. Our strategy, and we have a very clear scientific strategy, is recognizing that aging is by far the leading risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And there's been, over the last 100 years, a tremendous amount of research on the biology of aging, the basic mechanisms that lead to the fact that heart disease and diabetes and hypertension and Alzheimer's disease and cancer are all diseases of aging, and they all have some fundamental commonalities, including things like inflammation. And so these multiple pathways indicate, as you see at the bottom of your screen, and I don't have time to go into all of these, but we'll talk about some of them. The pathways that are non-amyloid pathways, as I mentioned in the video before, of the fact that inflammation, for example, is a hallmark of aging. And it's now finally recognized after many years that inflammation could be a drug target, that there's inflammation in the brain of people with Alzheimer's disease. There are all these misfolded proteins such as beta amyloid and many others, tau, that are toxic in the brain of Alzheimer patients and need to be removed. There's mitochondrial dysfunction that Dr. Brinton is one of our experts on. There's genetic risk factors like ApoE that we've been very involved in from a therapeutic point of view, and epigenetics, including the way that DNA is expressed, and other common biological pathways. And so our drug programs are very focused on these common biological pathways that relate to aging. It's really amazing that our modest foundation would be able to contribute to about 20% of all the drugs that are currently in development for Alzheimer's disease in the clinic. It's exciting that we have over 100 different drugs now in clinical trials. Again, our focus has been on the various aspects of aging, including neuroprotection, which is sort of a parsimonious approach to protecting the neurons regardless of the cause of injury. About half of our trials could be considered preventative in the sense that they're targeting a patient population that have mild cognitive impairment, which is the earliest clinical stage or one of the earliest clinical stages of the disease, where people just have primarily some mild memory problems, but they're still very functional. And most of our trials are in phase 2, which is the first time that drugs are actually tested in human beings for their effectiveness or their efficacy. And so we're very excited about where we are today in clinical development of drugs. And we have many different drugs, new chemical entities that are new novel chemistries, as well as repurposing drugs from other diseases. The key to, you heard about the diagnostics accelerator. Think about cholesterol and how cholesterol revolutionized the field of heart disease. Not just in early diagnosis, but cholesterol really made possible the development of drugs like statins, because there was a biomarker, and cholesterol is a biomarker. And we now have biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease that are really enabling these clinical trials. The ADDF helped to bring the first biomarker approved by the FDA, the PET amyloid scan, to market in 2012. And that scan enabled Biogen. You may have heard a lot of press recently about some exciting and promising news from Biogen about an anti-amyloid antibody in clinical development. Biogen is going to be going to the FDA to consider one of the first approvals for a new drug in Alzheimer's disease in the last, since 1994. And what enabled that Biogen trial, quite frankly, was the amyloid scan that the ADDF helped to develop. We also have many other biomarkers in development, including blood tests. And we're doing that through a $50 million fund, as was mentioned earlier, the Diagnostics Accelerator, which it's just been a tremendous advantage to the ADDF. I think it's going to make a huge contribution to the field to have blood tests and even digital technologies to make clinical trials and early diagnosis much more efficient, less expensive, and much more rigorous. So it's really going to be a revolution in Alzheimer's disease when we get these blood tests and digital technologies on the market. I just want to talk for a minute about Robbie Brinton. I've known Robbie since the early 1980s when we worked together at Rockefeller. It's really a privilege for me to be here and introduce her. We've both been in the field, dedicated our lives to this. Robbie's currently the director for the Center of Innovation and Brain Health and a professor of pharmacology and neurology at the College of Medicine at the University of Arizona. And she's going to talk to us about her work. We've been supporting Robbie for a number of years now, since 2005, on her drug allopregnanolone, which she's helping to develop. And as a result of some of our seed funding and funding over the years, Robbie recently received a grant from the National Institute on Aging for $37.5 million to develop her drugs. So let me thank you all for listening. Thank you all for attending today. And let me turn it over to Robbie and look forward to hearing from her. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. It's wonderful to be back at the Great Ladies Luncheon, even if it's virtual. And thank you too, Howard, for giving me that transformative experience of meeting one woman with Alzheimer's disease who transformed the life of this one woman neuroscientist. Through that experience, I have devoted my career and my science to first understanding why the brain develops Alzheimer's disease and why women are at a twofold greater lifetime risk for developing the disease. And we have focused our research also on how can we translate our discoveries into therapeutics to prevent and cure Alzheimer's disease. And I'm thrilled to give you an update on the project that ADDF funded from the very beginning on allopregnanolone, allo for short, ALLO, to be the first regenerative therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease to regenerate the degenerated brain. We have completed our phase 1 clinical trial, and we're very excited. We were able to treat people with early stage Alzheimer's disease for 3 months, and we have encouraging findings. First of all, it was a safety trial. Allopregnanolone is very safe and safe in this population. And what you see here are renditions of MRIs that were taken on each of the participants in our trial over the course of treatment. And what we find is early evidence, encouraging evidence that we'll pursue in the phase 2, but early evidence that those areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's disease, the hippocampus, the area of the brain that you're using quite extensively right now, is actually, looks like it could be regenerating. So obviously we have to go into a phase 2 clinical trial to state that definitively, but we have very encouraging evidence that we're able to regenerate, allo is able to regenerate the gray matter of the brain, the neurons, as well as the connections, the white matter of the brain. I'm also thrilled to report that our phase 2 is continuing, where we're gearing up for the trial. There's lots of work that has to be done before we actually treat patients, and we're continuing that work. We're able to continue that work very effectively, and we anticipate beginning recruitment of participants into the trial in September. And this will be a national trial, so there will be multiple sites across the nation that will be recruiting for this trial. So we're looking forward to starting that. We have also a new development where we submitted a proposal to the National Institute on Aging as part of our allopregnanolone clinical trial, phase 2, a supplement to take one of our Alzheimer's therapeutics that my colleagues and I have been developing for targeting inflammation in the brain, and now using that Alzheimer's potential therapeutic to treat people in the ICU who have this inflammatory storm that leads to death. So that trial, we hope will start soon. We just submitted the proposal to the National Institute on Aging last week. So we're quite enthusiastic to get started as soon as possible. We are also advancing our research on women's health and how that might play out in the development or risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And one of those populations are women who take these anti-estrogen therapies for breast cancer. And I'm happy to report, we just published a paper in March, came out in JAMA, that breast cancer therapies, specifically tamoxifen and a number of the aromatase inhibitors, reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So they're acting like an antagonist to estrogen in the breast and the uterus, but acting like an estrogen in the brain, which we're very excited about. We're also conducting an analysis of hormone therapies and that typically women take during the perimenopause or menopause for menopausal symptoms, and really trying to develop a precision hormone therapy approach for women to reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So that's our latest and greatest from here at the University of Arizona at the Center for Innovation in Brain Science, where we continue to move forward on multiple research fronts relevant to preventing, treating, and curing Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Robbie. I have one or two questions for you. One of the sort of obvious things is that women go through menopause and men don't, at least not in the same way for sure. And as you mentioned, women have a greater risk of Alzheimer's disease. I wonder if you could talk about your thoughts about what happens during the menopause that might contribute to the greater risk of dementia 20 years later in women.
Yeah. So what our research has shown over these many years since we started together at Rockefeller, what our research has shown is that it's not because women live longer than men. It's because they can start the disease process earlier, in midlife, in their 50s. And that develops during the perimenopause. What our research has shown is that even though we focus on perimenopause as a reproductive transition, it's really a neurological transition. So what we find is that estrogen, the loss of estrogen in the brain, leads to a reduced ability of the brain to metabolize glucose as its primary fuel. And that's why maintaining glucose homeostasis, maintaining good glucose control is so important, because the brain is the first organ affected by dysregulation in glucose metabolism. So that part of the equation is that the brain is down by about 20 to 25% in its ability to generate ATP, the energy driver of the brain. And that many of the women, well, all of the women in the room in this webinar are using this glucose to generate energy in the brain. That loss of that decline in the ability to generate energy leads to a compensatory response as if the brain were starving. And when the brain is starving, it utilizes auxiliary fuels, and that can put the brain at risk for ultimately developing Alzheimer's pathology.
So just as a follow-up, you mentioned about estrogen treatment at the time of menopause, and there's been controversy about the use of estrogens. The Women's Health Initiative study indicating perhaps women that took estrogen had a greater risk of dementia. And then more recently, maybe it's not so terrible, and maybe it could prevent Alzheimer's disease. So what's your view on whether menopausal women should start estrogen other than, of course, the hot flushes and so on? And how long should they stay on it? Should they stay on estrogen or hormone replacement for years and years and years, or just take it for a short period of time? What's your view on actual prescriptions here for the women in the audience?
Because I'm speaking with a clinician and the audience, that's fantastic. So as if I were advising you as a clinician, I would say that hormone therapy actually can reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And that was shown very early on. So, and I'm happy to say we just conducted an analysis that replicates that finding. We've yet to publish it, but it replicates that. And why we actually studied that was, yes, hormone therapy may be an effective way to reduce the risk by 50 to 60%. But the question is, which hormone therapy? For what woman? And when? And so when you look at the studies that showed reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease with hormone therapy, they were in women who were at the perimenopause or early menopause when they were having symptoms, not 15, 20 years after menopause. At that point, there's no benefit to hormone therapy. And by the way, the estrogen part of that trial, the later trial, didn't have any adverse outcomes. It was really when there was a combination therapy. Okay, so let's move back to when hormone therapy is actually therapeutically appropriate. And that's when women are having symptoms. And it's no accident that those symptoms are brain derived. Hot flashes come from the brain, cognitive deficits come from the brain, depression comes from the brain. So you look at all of these symptoms of menopause and they're brain derived. Right. Okay. So then the other question becomes, well, what hormone therapy for what woman? And that's the work that we are really engaged in right now. Which of those hormone therapies actually work? And why do they work in certain women and not in others? Why are there responders and not responders for the reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease? So we're hoping to publish this work, let's see, this is May, by around June. And the important part of that is we are publishing our work on our breast cancer therapy work and reduced risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And we'll publish this work on precision hormone therapy in journals that provide open access. So this will be accessible by all clinicians worldwide, by all women worldwide.
Okay, I think we have some questions. Maybe we could go to the audience now and ask some of those questions. And I have to figure out how to get those to you. Emily, maybe you can help me with that. Well, in the meantime, Robbie, if I may ask you, I know you recently started a biotech company, and so you're entering the world of industry as an entrepreneur, which is great. I wondered if you could tell us something about why you started a biotech company to advance your work, and what kind of different skills you're learning to doing that, and so on.
Yeah, so it's been a journey of becoming throughout my career. So we started the biotech company New Therapeutics, it's NEU Therapeutics, to really advance the commercialization of allopregnanolone as a therapeutic for Alzheimer's disease. It's very clear that it's absolutely necessary that scientists like me and you work on developing therapeutics. The challenge is that moving those discoveries into actually the clinic requires a commercial partner. And to do that, one really has to develop a commercial process, a commercial endeavor, to then really focus on how do we interact, how do we connect with the industry, pharma, that will ultimately bring the cure to everyone and to clinicians and their patients.
And that's certainly the model of ADDF. We've made over 140 investments in biotech companies like yours, startups and spin-outs and early stage companies to advance and help academic scientists advance their work. I have a question for myself from the audience, which is what can we do these days about prevention? And what's fascinating about prevention is that now there have been randomized clinical trials of multi-domain, multi-modal interventions. And what that means is if you look at all the risk factors for Alzheimer's, lifestyle risk factors like sedentary lifestyle, sitting in a chair all day, not getting enough sleep, drinking alcohol, and not getting exercise, as well as what we call the comorbidity risk factors like hypertension and diabetes. You can't just manage one of those and expect to slow down the rate of cognitive decline with aging or prevent dementia, particularly from Alzheimer's disease. So what one of our colleagues in Finland did several years ago, Dr. Mia Kilva-Pelto, was actually to organize one of the first actual randomized clinical trials where one group got sort of 1 day, one hour of health counseling, and the other group got intensive health counseling over a period of time and repeatedly to make sure that patients were compliant in terms of lifestyle risk factors, like I mentioned, and comorbidity management. And what's been shown is that you really can slow down the rate of cognitive decline with aging and prevent the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, prevent the brain shrinkage that occurs with Alzheimer's disease by lifestyle interventions. And now this is being shown all over the world. So we have really good evidence that what we used to say in terms of, what's good for your heart is good for your brain is one way to look at it, an easy way, is really true. I think the one main difference between the two may be that because the brain is our organ that interacts with the world and isolation is bad for us, that in addition to all the things that we do for our heart to maintain health, also staying socially or occupationally engaged and keeping your brain active is really important. So I'm very excited about prevention, and the ADDF is funding a number of prevention trials to take strategic focus on things that we can help with, such as what kind of antihypertensives are most brain protective. That's an emerging field. We're repurposing diabetes drugs to see how they're neuroprotective, and we've also invested in exercise programs. I think there's a question now for Dr. Brinton, and maybe Robbie, you can take that one if you can see it. I don't know if you can see it on the screen or not.
Oh, here we go.
Okay, it's who is eligible to participate in your clinical trial, and how can I enroll a loved one? So somebody wants to know how they could get into your clinical trial for ALA.
Perfect, wonderful. So we will be focusing the phase 2 clinical trial on persons who are in the early stages. So, and that will be determined at the clinic when we do the testing. So part of what we will be doing is sending out an announcement when we're beginning to recruit, and we are targeting early September for our recruitment into the trial. And perhaps, the ADDF can help us with, reaching large audiences for that recruitment. We will be having a public recruitment for the trial that is across the nation. So we anticipate having 20 clinical trial sites across the nation. So we'll be on the East Coast, we'll be in the Midwest, we'll be in the Southwest, and we'll be on the West Coast.
That's really exciting. Robbie, has COVID, I know for many of our programs, COVID has really had an impact. Patients don't want to go to the clinic for their visits, their clinical visits, and there's a lot more telehealth going on. People are getting assessed by computer for their cognition, for example, in these trials at home. Do you anticipate, or have you seen any impact of COVID on your clinical research so far?
So as I mentioned earlier, the impact of COVID on our research is actually putting in a clinical trial proposal for a therapeutic that can potentially save lives and targeting. Actually, it's a therapeutic that addresses the ACE2 receptor that is the site for COVID action, and actually working a workaround to alleviate the inflammation from that entire cascade. So we're very excited about that. The other is through our Center for Innovation in Brain Science, we have provided funds to a group who are looking at the long-term effects of COVID-19 infection. This is work and where they're using this platform, MindCrowd, all one word, MindCrowd, and then asking the people if they are willing to let them know whether they were infected by COVID-19, whether they were COVID-19 positive, and then tracking their cognitive function over time, because we know that one of the symptoms of COVID and one of the outcomes of the infection can in fact be cognitive decline. So we're very excited about this hopefully short-term clinical trial to save lives in the ICU and the long-term study that we're doing.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And it is interesting that the receptor for COVID on the blood vessels is the same receptor that antihypertension drugs use. And there's been some work in looking at which antihypertensives might actually benefit COVID patients. From the point of view of ADDF, we've been talking to investigators in Melbourne, Australia, in Edinburgh, Scotland, here in New York, as we do our progress calls with our investigators. And, really without exception, the COVID has had a big impact on clinical research, and people are, in some cases, shut down and really trying to figure out what kind of statistical methods to use when there's a lot of dropouts. You have to invoke and involve the statisticians to help us figure out how we can glean all the insights we can from these trials, even in the face of what are called protocol violations, where people don't show up for their visits or are, instead of getting in-visit assessments, are getting visits by telehealth. And I think that even the FDA is sensitive to this issue. So we're going to figure it out. But I think it's, for example, we had one trial where they hoped to recruit a certain number of patients, and because of COVID, they've downsized the trial and things like that. So I think COVID is having a big impact for us as well. Let me see the next question here, if I may. Right, so I'll just start on an answer to this one and turn it to you, Robbie. The question is there still hope for an anti-amyloid therapy? I have to say that the results are more recently kind of incredible, because we've had many anti-amyloid clinical trials over the years, and almost without exception, they all failed from the point of view of showing clinical benefit, but they also didn't really show any benefit in terms of changing the target, which is those senile plaques, those amyloid plaques in the brain. And as I mentioned earlier, the PET amyloid scan that ADDF helped to develop really enabled Biogen to show something that I think is amazing, which is that people who got their anti-amyloid monoclonal antibody, or the amyloid vaccine, if you will, they had the amount of plaque in their brain as measured by the PET amyloid scan reduced by 80-90%. 80-90% of the patients at the end of 18 months had no plaque left in their brain. And that's amazing. That showed, because of that biomarker, Biogen was able to show that the drug worked. It hit its target. It removed the plaque from the brain. And they were also, because of that, able to analyze the data and show that those people who were on the highest dose for the longest period of time actually did have a slowing in their cognitive assessments and in their cognitive decline, and even in their function, in their decline in function, suggesting that the drug worked clinically as well as from a biological point of view. And what enabled that, again, was the relationship between the biomarker and the clinical assessments. So the next trials will obviously be at a higher dose for a longer period of time, but there was enough data out of that trial to indicate that Biogen is going to go to the FDA for an approval. And whether they get that or not, and have to do another phase 3 study, I think that there is some hope now for anti-amyloid therapies that we didn't have before, and there are other amyloid antibodies in development now that might. We don't think that this is going to be the final answer, that we don't think that this is going to be something that's going to be the only drug. We think that there's going to be, again, a cocktail, a combination, 4 or 5 drugs. People will have to take 3, 4, 5 drugs, but it'll be a major advance. And let me turn it over to you, Robbie, for your thoughts on amyloid therapies these days.
So our approach has been not to look at the downstream late kind of pathologies so much as asking the question, why is the brain developing those pathologies? And actually figuring out what's happening very, very early on in the disease process so that the pathology doesn't develop at all. And so that's where our focus has been, because beta amyloid and tau in the brain, neurofibrillary tangles in the brain, are the consequence of events that have happened and continue to happen. So part of that has really been asking the question, again, that's where studying women has just been so productive, because 2/3 of all people with Alzheimer's disease are women. And so we really took the approach, I really took the approach that, wait a minute, if we understood why 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's disease are women and understood what was happening in their brain, the worst case scenario is that we have 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's disease covered. And it turns out that studying the female brain has really taught us what to ask in the male brain. And it's no surprise, women's brains and male brains are different. They end up having the same pathology, but the way they get there is different. And it all has to do with that energy production in the brain and the fuels that are being used by the brain, and whether that person is ApoE4 positive or ApoE3 or ApoE4 negative and only ApoE3. So we're really going to need the precision medicine approach that ADDF has championed from the very beginning.
Well, thank you, Rob.
Precision medicine.
Thank you, Robbie. And I certainly agree with you on the issue of, really we have to get to prevention, and learning from what's happening in women is a good way to get there. The next question we have is about repurposing. ADDF has a large repurposing portfolio of about 20 different drugs, clinical trials and drugs and clinical trials that are called repurposing. So what is repurposing? Well, a lot of drugs on the market today are drugs that were first developed for one disease, and then somebody had the insight to use that drug for another disease. And there's some good examples. Aspirin, for example, was used for pain and fever and inflammation. And now, it's been recognized that aspirin could be repurposed and useful for preventing heart disease. Take a baby aspirin a day for your heart disease. Another drug was thalidomide, a horrible drug with terrible side effects in fetus and in infants back in the 50s, repurposed for multiple myeloma, became the widest selling drug, most commonly used drug for multiple myeloma, led to the creation of one of the most successful biotech companies in the world, Celgene. Many examples like that. What ADDF has been doing is, because pharma generally is not interested in repurposing experiments, there are obstacles to commercialization and so on, we've been funding the commercial pathways because these drugs that are on the market for other diseases, we know their safety profiles, we know their mechanism of action. Most often, we also know from preclinical research that they can affect amyloid production in animal models, and we know their mechanism of action in these Alzheimer animal models. So there's good reason to repurpose these drugs for Alzheimer's disease, there's epidemiological evidence of associations of certain drugs with the reduced risk of Alzheimer's. So we gather together the evidence and decide whether a Parkinson's drug or an ALS drug or a cancer drug could be useful for Alzheimer's. And so we funded a number of these trials. Most recently, we funded a clinical trial of a cancer drug at Georgetown, which seems to have great benefit. I'm waiting for the paper to be published before I could really talk about the results, but they're really exciting results. We've also had presentations of drugs like rasagiline, which is a Parkinson's drug that was recently reported out by Jeff Cummings and Dawn Matthews at an international meeting. This Parkinson's drug, rasagiline, seemed to have benefit in patients with Alzheimer's disease. Another repurposed drug I'm very excited about is a drug called Riluzole, which is currently under study at Rockefeller University and Mount Sinai, and we're going to hear about the results of that drug in the third or fourth quarter of this year, and I'm very excited about that. And finally, a drug that I'll mention is called levetiracetam, which is an epilepsy drug that's now one of, I think, the only non-anti-amyloid drugs that are currently in phase 3 for Alzheimer's disease, that last stage before FDA approval. And Michaela Gallagher at Johns Hopkins took a similar course to you, Robbie. She had spent many decades studying in her neuroscience lab how problems with the hippocampus, and she thought that this epilepsy drug would be valuable for people with mild cognitive impairment. Spun out a company called Agene Bio, which we were seed investors in, and now that company is again doing a phase 3 trial with this repurposed drug with some funding from ADDF and a lot of money from the National Institute on Aging. So yeah, we're very excited about our repurposing portfolio. We've got a lot of positive results, and right now we're working on an initiative to figure out how we can contribute to commercializing those results. So that's the next thing, and I'm going to try to see this next question that's come up, if I may. Okay, another question is about public-private partnerships, and Robbie, you and I can both probably talk to this. We certainly collaborate. I think we're involved in a number of great public-private partnerships with the government, with the National Institute on Aging and the National Institute for Neurological Diseases, which is the main funder of vascular dementia, an underserved area of dementia, especially in the oldest old. And so the ADDF partners with the National Institute on Aging and the NINDS and others in the government on a regular basis. We have some formal programs. We also partner with groups like the Association for Frontotemporal Dementia and other groups that fund Alzheimer's, because even the ADDF, and we're we can't do everything. This clinical development takes tens of millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And so we need all of the pieces of all the silos of the ecosystem in drug development, pharmaceutical industry, biotech industry, government, philanthropy to work together. And we're partnering with drug companies like Eli Lilly and others. We're partnering with and funding biotech companies. And so this ecosystem has really been wonderful. I think the ecosystem of Alzheimer's drug development research is amazing. There's partnerships with hundreds of scientists at NIA has put together, National Institute on Aging that we're part of, and we contribute some money through the Foundation for NIH. And so it's really been very productive, very exciting work on neuroimaging, the Alzheimer's disease neuroimaging initiative, and other hundreds of millions of dollars in public-private partnerships that we're part of. Very proud to be part of. Robbie, maybe you want to comment on how public-private partnerships work in your place and your efforts.
I would say that the role of philanthropy has always played a huge part in our ability to innovate all over these many years. And philanthropy is really the launch pad to get that critical data that you can convince your scientific colleagues that you really know what you're doing and you can really do this. And so that's where ADDF was so critical in development of allo for Alzheimer's disease. I still remember, Howard, when we had our conversation, you said, just cut to the chase, Robbie, does it work? And it was a great translational moment for me because you really want to get to that, the does it work question and answer that question early. So philanthropy has been, and ADDF has been critical at each stage of our development for this therapeutic program that we're developing as a regenerative therapeutic. Nobody decades ago would have ever thought that the Alzheimer's brain could regenerate itself.
Well, thank you for that, Robbie. I really appreciate it. And I think that philanthropy can play a catalytic role with a modest amount of dollars to really get innovation and take risk. And then that, as in your case, we were able to fund you since 2005, and now you've gotten a $37.5 million grant to actually do the phase 2 clinical trial from the National Institute on Aging. So I really appreciate your thoughts about the role of philanthropy. Okay, we're going to go to the last question from the audience, which is sort of a hard question. How soon will we have effective Alzheimer's treatments? And after so many failures, why are we still optimistic? And I'll let you go first, Robbie, on that one.
So what's so exciting about this time now is that, ADDF and the National Institute on Aging has been supporting all of these innovative ideas, all of this platform, this foundation for precision medicine in Alzheimer's disease. Because as you said, one size is not going to fit all, and it's not going to fit all for all time. So we're going to need a portfolio of therapeutics that we can bring forward to treat the right person at the right time. And that's what's so exciting about this time now. While the amyloid therapies have been developing, there's been this whole community of dedicated, persevering scientists and clinicians who have been working for decades. And we're here now, and we're ready to go.
Right. And, we love science, and science is an incremental process. We always say in science that, if your experiment doesn't raise more questions than it answers, it wasn't a good experiment. And, this pursuit of knowledge to ultimately develop a drug, we're in the business of trying to develop a little white pill that's going to prevent and treat Alzheimer's disease. And, to me, that's an amazing goal. And I like to say it's harder than trying to put a man on the moon or a woman, because we've already put people on the moon. And, but you and I have been working about 40 years at this, and yes, failure after failure after failure. But, it was said by Judy Lewin, who was the CFO for Merck for many years, that 90% of the people who work in the pharmaceutical industry will spend their entire careers never working on a drug that comes to market. That's how hard it is to develop a drug. And yet we've made amazing progress. I mean, from when you and I think about where we were back in the 1980s, where we couldn't really diagnose people and we didn't know how to do clinical trials because there weren't any. I mean, you and I, we did one of the first clinical trials of estrogen for women with, dementia, back in the 1980s. Who knows? Today we have examples like Biogen where we have biomarkers, we can get readouts, we know how to do the clinical trials, we can do very sophisticated cognitive assessments. We have neuroimaging, which has just revolutionized the field. So, I just think it's an amazing time. And I think we will have drugs on the market in the next 5 years, certainly. We're definitely going to have a blood test in 2 or 3 years. We've learned how to do clinical trials. I mean, if you think about it, there have been clinical trials in cancer going on for 70 or 80 years. We're just entering the rigorous age of clinical trials testing drugs for Alzheimer's, and we're finally breaking out into, as we've discussed, these novel mechanisms and new biology. So we've spent a lifetime doing this, but I've never been more excited. And we've learned so much over the years. It's just incredible. So with that, I think we're actually out of time, Robbie. I want to thank you for working with ADDF, as always, over these many years. We really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us. And I think I'm going to turn it over to wherever this goes next. I think it goes back to Andrea at this point. So thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, everyone. Stay well.
Thank you, Dr. Fillit and Dr. Brinton, for that wonderful, informative symposium. The science that drives the ADDF and moves all of us forward wouldn't be possible without our event honorees, who so generously share their personal stories to help advance awareness of Alzheimer's and advocate for this research. Many of you may remember last year's Great Ladies honoree, T.J. Oshie, the Washington Capitals right wing and 2018 Stanley Cup champion. T.J. has brought much attention to Alzheimer's disease by sharing his father's struggle with this devastating disease.
Oh man, sorry. For my dad, who has Alzheimer's, his memory's slipping a little these days. I think this is one memory that I don't think he's gonna forget.
What is it like to have him here?
Oh, to have him here is amazing. I love you, Coach. We did it. Yeah, we did it. Mom and Dad be so proud. Oh, we did it, Big Dad. I know. You're not gonna forget this one, hey? Stick together. We did it, yeah. We stuck together. Yeah, we did. I love you, son. I love you, Coach.
TJ continues to raise awareness through his work with the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, including hosting a broomball tournament this winter to benefit this event. We are so pleased to have TJ back this year to pass the torch to our new honorees, Thomas Pheasant, a friend of mine, and Jay O'Connor, on behalf of the O'Connor family. So on behalf of the ADDF, I'm honored to welcome back TJ Oshie.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to be back here with my ADDF family at the 10th Annual Great Ladies Luncheon. Like many of you, I've been spending the last few weeks social distancing at home with my family. While it's disappointing to stop our season on the verge of the playoffs, it's important that we all do our part, and I'm looking forward to being back on the ice in the near future. But there has been one upside to this situation, and that is spending a lot of quality time with my wife, Lauren, 2 girls, Lila and Lenny, and newborn son, and future golf partner, Campbell. Family is important to me, especially right now. As many of you know, my dad, Tim Oshie, or Coach, as I call him, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's several years ago. This was a devastating diagnosis for me and my family, and it's one of the reasons I connected with the ADDF's mission. We need effective treatments to treat and prevent Alzheimer's, and I believe the ADDF is the organization that will help us find a cure. We can't do that alone, and we need to band together to continue supporting the ADDF. For those of you who have already donated, thank you. For those of you who haven't, please consider making a donation to support the critical research that will move us closer towards a cure. Last year I had the privilege of being honored at this event, and this year I'm thrilled to pass the torch to Thomas Pheasant and former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor and her family, who will be honored in person next year at the 11th Annual Great Ladies Luncheon. Both honorees will be recognized for their dedication, leadership, and support of ADDF's mission to rapidly accelerate the discovery of drugs to prevent, treat, and cure Alzheimer's disease. I want to thank you all for being here with me today, and a special thanks to Kelly Ripken for connecting me to the ADDF and to Dr. Howard Fillit, who has done a great deal for my family. Stay safe and see you next year.
Thank you, TJ, for those inspiring words. Thanks to Elise Lefkowitz, the founder of this event, over the years, the Great Ladies Luncheon has partnered with numerous fashion visionaries to showcase exquisite couture, which helps to benefit the ADDF's core research initiatives. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Charlie Lefkowitz, Elise's daughter, who has a special message in honor of the 10th anniversary of this event.
Thank you, Andrea, for the warm welcome. And thank you to the Lauder family. Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Lefkowitz Crowley, and I'm so excited to be here with you today. For those of you who know my mom, Elise Lefkowitz, you are familiar with the warmth, elegance, and kindness she radiates, all of which she has graciously poured into this unbelievable event over the last decade. 10 years ago, my mom had a vision to create a wonderful tradition to unite families battling this terrible disease and raise funds to bring us closer to a cure.
We started out with just a small group of ladies, and look what it's turned into, and I hope we can keep on going. So thank you very, very much from the bottom of my heart. My mom thanks you too, and thank you.
I am proud to share her vision has become a wonderful reality, thanks in part to your continued support. My mom founded this event to honor my grandmother, Estelle Gelman, who battled Alzheimer's for more than 15 years before she passed. The format of the Great Ladies Luncheon, the pairing of fashion and research, is a nod to the luncheons my grandmother used to hold as the first female president of the American Cancer Society. Through the generosity of our fashion partners, Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue, and designers like Derek Lam, Oscar de la Renta, Carolina Herrera, and many more, the runway show has been the heart and soul of the Great Ladies Luncheon, with many of these beautiful creations benefiting ADDF's critical research. On behalf of the Lefkowitz and Miller families, thank you, Mom, for all you've done, and we're looking forward to 10 more years of wonderful successes. We love you.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for that deeply moving message. A special thanks to our founding executive chairs, Leonard Lauder, Ronald Lauder, and last but not least, Elise and Mark Lefkowitz, along with our fantastic co-chairs, whose never-ending support, creativity, and flexibility allowed us to enjoy today's wonderful event while safely social distancing. On behalf of the ADDF, I'd like to thank all of you, without whom none of this would be possible. Your steadfast support continues to drive some of the most exciting advancements in our understanding of Alzheimer's disease and our development of cutting-edge treatments. With that in mind, we invite everyone join us next year in person as we celebrate the 11th annual Great Ladies Luncheon. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please stay safe and healthy.